Good evening and welcome to All Things Fulfill. I'm William Bell. It has been a while since I had the opportunity and privilege to sit down and make a video because of so much stuff going on in the background. However, this has been one of the very important weeks as it relates to matters that pertain to eschatology. And because of that, I missed a tremendous opportunity to share some information regarding the rapture, even though I'm going to refer you to a video I did back in 2017 that if you had watched, those of you who fell subject to the teaching about the rapture, you would have saved yourselves a lot of trouble and grief. And so I think it would be beneficial for you to have that. But I want to take some time to go over something since we have gone past the 23rd, the 24th, and we're just about to end the 25th here in America, even though they've already ended in other places in the world. And you see that a rapture has not occurred. So let me talk about a few things, hopefully that will help you as you contemplate this maybe for the future. First of all, there are three texts that are associated with the rapture, that are commonly associated with the rapture. The first one is Matthew 24 and verse 31, that talks about the gathering at the sound of the trumpets, gathering from the four winds. That's one text. A second text is John chapter 14, verses 1 through 3. And then the third one is First Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. Now, these are the verses that are generally associated with the rapture. One of the most important points for each of these texts is to study them in their context. In other words, don't just go and pull a passage out and say, this is what the text is talking about, when you have no idea or understanding of what the context is surrounding those particular passages. That's what causes a lot of people to misunderstand them. And secondly, you already agree that the timing of each of those three texts that I mentioned is the same. In other words, the timing of Matthew 24:31 has to be equal with the timing of John 14, 1 through 3, which also has to be equal to the timing of First Thessalonians 4. Because if you're taking all of them as the rapture, they would all be occurring at the same time. Now, here's why that's important. Once I establish from the scriptures the timing of Matthew chapter 24, then you will know the timing of John 14 and also First Thessalonians 4. The reason I'm saying that is because that's a point where we must already agree. And then secondly, it's because I don't have time in this video to teach each of those texts separately. I will come back and maybe do one or two or both of them in a later video because I think First Thessalonians 4 especially is one that we need to give a bit more attention. Now, once we understand that, it's important to understand as we're trying to establish context to know a few things about that. One, we need to know who is doing the speaking in a particular text that you're studying from the scriptures. Number two, who is being spoken to. So we identify the speaker and those who are being spoken to. And then thirdly, we need to know who or what is being spoken about. It would be helpful to know something about the culture of the people at the time it is being spoken, and also the historical context and the purpose for which the author made the statements that we're going to contemplate. Now, having said that, we want to look at the fact that the occasion of Matthew 24, where we see verse 31, which is the rapture text we want to be considering, starts actually in Matthew chapter 23. Some will say that it starts earlier than that, and it most certainly does. But for our study tonight, we're going to look at it based on Matthew 23 because it is more particularly related to the subject matter that we're going to look at. And Matthew 23 was spoken in a context related to the fall of the temple that was in Jerusalem in the first century. Jesus is chiding the Pharisees as murderers or the children of those who murdered the prophets. And he tells them that they were the sons of those who murdered the prophets and that he was going to send to them wise men, scribes, and some of them they were going to kill, they were going to persecute, they were going to scourge or beat in their synagogues and also crucify them. And he said that upon them would come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom they murdered between the temple and the altar. So he's now charging them as the sons of those who killed the prophets and saying to them that they're going to do the same thing. So now we're getting a context that he's talking about people in the first century. And so he goes on further to say this: "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who stones the prophets or kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her." He says, "How often would I gather you as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Behold, your house is left to you desolate." So he just told them that they are going to murder the prophets. He wanted to gather them as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but they were not willing. And he says, because of that, your house is left to you desolate. But all of those things were going to come upon them within that same generation. Now, that temple was standing in the first century. Once he had made that statement, they went out. And as they went out, they were admiring the stones of the temple. And when Jesus saw his disciples admiring the stones of the temple, he said to them, "Do you not see here all these stones that are present?" He says, "There is not one stone that is left, that is, upon another, that would not be thrown down." And so when he said that, of course, with all of the history of the temple and with all their allegiance and loyalty and understanding of the significance of that temple to their worship and to their cultural life as well, they raised the question, "Lord, when will these things be?" Speaking particularly about the temple. "And what will be the sign of your coming?" Because he had mentioned that also in Matthew 23 and verse 38. He says, "You will not see me henceforth until you hear one say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" And when they asked about his coming, that word means presence. It's the word parousia in the Greek, and it means presence. And then he said, they asked, "And of the consummation of the age." Now, because so many people are familiar with the King James Version, we have the word world there, and many associate that with the end of the physical world. But that was far from the minds of the disciples and the teaching of Christ, because they never asked about the end of the material world or the physical world. They wanted to know when was the end of the age in which they lived, which was the age of Moses or the Old Covenant age, whichever you want to associate that with. But it was that age in which they were then living. So not the end of a physical world, but the end of an epoch of time. That's where they saw these events occurring. Now, having understood that, Jesus gives them several signs to know when these things were going to occur. And he tells them that there would be wars and rumors of wars. He also tells them that there would be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in diverse places. But the end would not be just yet when they saw those things. Those were still signs that would lead up to the end. But remember, who is doing the talking? It's Christ. Who is he speaking to? Peter, James, John, and Andrew, disciples that were in the first century. So his audience was a first century audience, not a 21st century audience. Furthermore, he said there would be false messiahs. You can read Acts chapter 5 and chapter 8, and you can read about false messiahs right there in the scriptures in the first century. In addition, he told them that the gospel had to be preached in all the inhabited earth as a witness to all the nations, and then the end would come. Now, there are many people and preachers, etc., out there who say that the gospel has not yet been preached to all the world. That's not true. The Bible affirms that within the first century, the very time frame that Jesus is speaking to his disciples, the gospel had in fact gone to all the world. You can read it in Romans 1 and verse 8, where Paul says the gospel had come to you, that their faith had been spoken of throughout the world. You can read it in Romans 10 and verse 18. He said the gospel had come to all the inhabited earth, the very word used in Matthew 24:14, and it had gone to all the land, such as we find in the statement in Acts chapter 1 and verse 8. When we turn to Romans 15:25 and 26, he says that it had gone to all the nations for the obedience of faith. And again, in Colossians 1, 5, and 6, it had come into all the world or the cosmos. And then in Colossians 1 and verse 23, Paul said that it had been preached to every creature or all the creation which was under heaven. That was in the early 60s, therefore confirming that the gospel had in fact gone to all the inhabited earth, to all the nations, to all the creatures or creation under heaven in the first century. But remember, Jesus said when that had been fulfilled, then the end would come. So the expectation should be that the end was going to come within that first century when these things were fulfilled. Now, after that, he tells them in verse 15 that when they saw the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, and let everyone who reads understand, that it was spoken by the prophet Daniel. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of standing in the holy place, then he says, let those who are in Judea flee. Now, the holy place was the temple, the very temple that Jesus had spoken about earlier. So it was when they saw this abomination of desolation, these zealots, etc., standing in the holy place, who were overthrowing everything and trying to overrun the priesthood, which they did, and many other abominable things that they did in order to invoke the war against the Romans and prevent those who wanted to surrender from doing so, usurping the priesthood, all kinds of things that they were doing. Jesus said those who were in Judea were to flee. And he gives them instructions concerning their flight, that it not be in the winter or on the Sabbath day. Why? Because the gates of the city would be locked and they would have an impediment from getting out, even if they were traveling with, women pregnant with babies, etc. All of that was focused on that particular historical time frame in the first century. All of these things are recorded by historians in the first century. Josephus, Tacitus, all talked about these events that occurred. And then he says, after that would be a time of great tribulation, such as has not been since there was a nation, even to that time, no, nor ever shall be. So Jesus just placed the great tribulation within that very time frame, saying that that would be a time that would come upon that nation, meaning the nation of the Jews. And he says that it would never happen again. So he's locked in the Great Tribulation to that same historical time frame when the temple was standing in the first century. Now, look, that temple has been destroyed for almost 2,000 years. It was destroyed in the first century when the Romans invaded Judea, according to Luke chapter 21, verses 20 through 22. And when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of it depart. And let not those who are in the country enter into it. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. That's a very important text, because Jesus said when the temple was destroyed, that would be when all things written would be fulfilled. But let's continue on. So after that, he tells them, then they would see signs in the heavens, the sun and moon darkening, the sun darkening and the moon turning to blood, and the stars not giving their light. Now, many people would think that these are the heavenly luminaries that are falling down, but if you are familiar with the language and the culture of the Jews, you would understand that what they were talking about were civil and religious authorities falling, who were called lights, referred to as the sun, moon, and stars. Go back to Genesis chapter 37 and read about Joseph and the dream that he had when he dreamed that the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars would come and bow down and worship him. His father interpreted that dream. He says, shall I, that is the father representing the son, and your mother, who represented the moon, and your 11 brothers come and worship you. And of course, his brothers envied and hated him for that dream. But there's one example where it shows you that sun, moon, and stars referred to people. And if you study Isaiah chapter 34 and also Isaiah 13, you will see that it referred to civil nations, but it also referred to religious nations and referred to Israel as well, and even to things related to the temple. So if you're reading from a 21st century mind and don't understand the culture of this, then you'll be caught up with these physical things of the world, trying to interpret it from the standpoint of scientific things, etc., and physical elements that have nothing to do with the scriptures. And that's all because people have not immersed themselves into the language of scripture. The next thing he says, that once they saw those things, then they would see the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Then all the tribes of the land would mourn. Now, the land is typically the land of Israel. That's what he's talking about. He's not talking about all over the world. He's saying in the land of Israel. The tribes were the tribes of Israel. That's a prophecy from Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 10 through 14. So he's discussing those things, saying that all the tribes of the land will mourn. Why? Because they were the ones who pierced Christ. They were the ones who crucified him. And now that judgment that Jesus had talked about in Matthew 23 is coming to pass on them within that same generation. And so all the tribes of the land will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with power and great glory. And coming on the clouds doesn't mean that Jesus was going to physically come, just as when you look at Isaiah 19, the Bible spoke about the Lord will come riding on a swift cloud and riding into Egypt. Well, that happened back during the time of Sargon and the Egypt invasion, etc. It had nothing to do, the Assyrian invasion, it had nothing to do with the Lord riding on a physical cloud. But that's what people think, and that's how they misunderstand the scriptures. And when we understand the time frame of these events, we will know that it is referring to events that transpired in that generation. And so he gives an illustration talking about the fig tree, but now watch what he said. Or even before that, in verse 31, which is the rapture text. Now notice we're looking at all of this in context. So when you look at verse 31, he says, and then he will send out his angels to gather his elect from the four winds. And the four winds just means the north, south, east, and west, with the sound of a trumpet. Now, that sound of a trumpet is very, very important. And it also comes out of prophecy from Numbers 10, from Isaiah chapter 27, verse 13, and from Leviticus chapter 23, verses 26 through 32, that we're going to say more about in just a minute. But that trumpet sound is the Feast of Trumpets. It's the time of Jubilee, which is also Leviticus 25 and verse 9. All of these things are rooted in Old Testament prophecy. But let's go on. And so there would be the sounding of the trumpet and the gathering of his elect from the four winds. And then it gives this illustration about the fig tree, etc. And then we have this statement, which is so very, very important. This is the statement that your preachers, many of them, don't like to hear, that they try to explain away, and they try to tell you it doesn't mean what it means. It doesn't mean what it says, I should say. But here's what it says. Jesus spoke saying this to his apostles: assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Now, notice all the things that we've just outlined for you, that we've just enumerated. He said that the generation that was then living on earth in the first century, when the temple was still standing, would by no means pass away till all those things took place. Well, that covers Matthew 24 and verse 31. It covers which is the gathering of the elect. It covers verse 30, which is the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds. It covers verse 29, which is the sun, moon, and stars falling. It covers verse 21, which is the time when he says there would be such tribulation, such as has not been since there was a nation, no, nor ever shall be. It covers the time of the flight from Judea. It covers the time of the abomination of desolation. It covers the time where the gospel had to go to all the world, as we've already demonstrated. It covers the time of the false Christ, of the famines, the pestilences, and the earthquakes, all that are documented historically leading up to the fall of Jerusalem. And it covers, as we said, the wars and rumors of wars. All of those things led up to the fall of the temple, where Jesus said those were the days when all things written would be fulfilled. Now, remember, we made the point earlier that when we establish the time of one of the verses, since all of them are rapture verses, that must also be the time of the other verses. So that would mean that John 14, 1 through 3, where Jesus said, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions or abiding places. If it were not so, I would have told you, I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go, I will come again and there receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also. But he said all of that would take place within that generation. We just read that. You have to connect Matthew 24, and particularly verse 34, with John 14. And then thirdly, the same thing for 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. That is the, I would say, among those who believe in this alleged future rapture, the supreme rapture text. But even in that text, Paul said, we who are alive and remain. He's talking about the people in that generation who would be alive and remain until the coming of the Lord. All those passages go together. All right, so that covers the time of all three of the texts. So let me end this video by speaking of the objection that we always get when we present this information. And that is on Matthew 24 and verse 36. So they clap back and they say, oh, but no man knows the day or the hour. And the scripture does say that. It says, neither the Son nor the angels, etc., but my Father only. But here's the point. That text is misunderstood and mistranslated, or not mistranslated, misinterpreted by those who use it to try to negate everything that the text has said. How much sense does that make? When Jesus tells you all those things would take place in association with the temple and those living in the first century generation, and then come back and say, well, no man knows the day and the hour, and you use that statement to negate everything that he said. Doesn't make any sense. What he's saying is based on a text in Leviticus. I'm going to put the text on the screen so you can take a look at it. So let's go to, let me see if I can share my screen here very quickly and put this text up. All right. Now, this text is from what is called the Feast of Trumpets. The Feast of Trumpets was one of the Hebrew festivals, one of God's holy festivals, and that the Hebrew people followed every single year. They practiced every single year. They were like dress rehearsals or convocations, but they followed them every year. Now, the Feast of Trumpets had several names. It was called the wedding feast. That's why it's associated with John 14, because John 14 is a wedding text. But it was also called the Day of Judgment. It was called the Day of the Coronation of the King. The Feast of Trumpets, Rosh Hashanah, is another name that it's referred to. It was the time of the resurrection. It was the time of the calling of a solemn assembly. All of these names were associated with what's called the Feast of Trumpets. Now, why did they call it the Feast of Trumpets? It's because it was the only day of those festivals that came on the first day of the month. All of the rest of them came within the month. Like even here, when you look at them, you will see the Day of Atonement that came on the 10th of the 7th month, the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles that came on the 15th. The Passover was on the 14th, the Feast of Unleavened Bread on the 15th, the Feast of First Fruits, etc., and the Day of Pentecost, all of those. But the Feast of Trumpets came on the first day of the 7th month. That happened every single year in Israel's festal calendar, and they had been practicing it for generations, one after the other, for about 1,500 years. So they were very familiar with that. Here is another name for that day. It was called the Unknown Day. Now, why was it called the Unknown Day? Well, because they didn't know the day and the hour, they had to have watchers who would go out and look for the first sign of the full moon. And then that had to be confirmed with the priest. And once it was confirmed, then the priest would give the order to sound the trumpets. And that would notify the people that the Feast of Trumpets had begun and that it was the time of judgment, that they had to prepare themselves to come before God for the Day of Atonement, because if they had not, then they would not be forgiven. And so that's what that was all about. But it became known as the Unknown Day. But the Unknown Day in their historical and cultural history happened every single year. It just became known as the Unknown Day. Because it was unknown didn't mean that it wasn't coming that year. It came every single year as the Unknown Day. So here's the point. The Unknown Day to Jesus's audience was a day they recognized. You can also see it in Zechariah chapter 14, verses 5 and 6. They recognized that. Any Jew in that audience would have known what he meant when he says no man knows the day and the hour. He wasn't saying the event would not occur in that generation as he had promised them in verse 34. What he was saying was they didn't know the day or the hour in which it would occur within that generation. But he certainly wasn't saying it was not going to occur. And as he does in all judgment situations, as you look through the scriptures, you will see that the closer they got to the time, the more information was given to let them know when that event would occur. Now, that's what that means. So if you're caught up in the rapture, and I know for many of you, it's been a very, very traumatic time, and our hearts go out to you for believing in this myth, for believing in this error, for believing in this deception, and especially for those of you who have given away your possessions. I've heard people say they gave away their smartphones, they have given away their money, and they're still giving it away. They've quit their jobs, giving up their houses, etc. And this happens almost every year when they predict this over and over again. It's time to wise up. Look, I made a video in the year 2017 regarding these things. I'm going to put the link in the bottom of this video so you can go back and watch that. It got over 59,000 views. So that should tell you that it was worth watching. But if people had watched that video before they got caught up in the rapture this time, they wouldn't be in the state that they're in. They wouldn't be discouraged. They wouldn't be talking about they're giving up on Christianity. They're giving up their faith. They don't know where to turn. The place to turn is to the scriptures. And once you understand the scriptures, you will know that nothing can shake your faith. If you see that these events have been fulfilled in the past, in the first century, there's nothing to shake your faith. And that doesn't mean the end of Christ or the end of God's work. because the scripture in Revelation 21 talks about the tabernacle of God coming down to be with men, where God will be their people and they will serve him, etc. Beautiful message. We've been covering that in many of our videos, but we encourage you to watch that. So I'm going to end here, and thank you for watching. I hope that it's been a blessing to you. Study these things out carefully for yourself. There are many people who have made changes in their life. They have changed their doctrine. They have been delivered from this rapture deception that people are still falling subject to as they pay attention to what the scripture says. All right, I'm going to close here, and thank you once again for watching. Subscribe to our channel so that you can hear more of these things, and it'll give you a better understanding of these scriptures related to the end time. In addition, like the video. If you like it, leave us some comments. We'd like to hear what you have to say about it, and we'll respond to you so that you can get some interaction on some of the things that may be of interest to you. With that, I want to say good evening to you, and we'll see you in the next video.